Good evening. I'm Marnie Smith from the Burlington Public Library. I'm excited about tonight's program with Nancy Horan and Therese Fowler, two best-selling authors who will talk about Nancy's new book, The House of Lincoln. I want to thank the authors for generously giving their time and Christina Ariola from Sourcebooks for putting this program together. I also want to thank the 49 libraries who are partnering with the Burlington Public Library tonight. If you're interested in buying one of Nancy or Therese's books, I'll put a link in the chat to River Dog Book Company's website, where each purchase supports the independent bookstores. Now I'll introduce the authors. Therese Fowler is the New York Times, IndieBound, and USA Today best-selling author of multiple novels, including Z, a novel of Zelda Fitzgerald, which was adapted for television starring Christina Ricci. And most recently, It All Comes Down to This. She's been a finalist for the Goodreads Choice Award and the Southern Book Prize for Fiction. Her articles and essays have appeared in The Week, Harper's Bazaar, The Telegraph, and elsewhere. Therese earned a BA in sociology, cultural anthropology, and an MFA in creative writing, both from North Carolina State University. She lives in Raleigh, North Carolina with her husband, author John Kessel. Nancy Horan's new book, The House of Lincoln, was published on June 6th. She's also the author. Thank you, I've got one too.
I've got one, not in reach.
She's also the author of Loving Frank, which chronicles a little-known chapter in the life of legendary American architect Frank Lloyd Wright and his client, Mayma Chaney, and Under the Wide and Starry Sky, which explores the unlikely relationship of Robert Louis Stevenson and his spirited American wife, Fanny Vandergrift Stevenson. A native Midwesterner, Nancy Horan was a Chicago journalist before turning to fiction writing. She now lives with her husband on an island in Puget Sound. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Nancy and Therese.
Glad to be here.
Same. Thanks, Marty, for that introduction. I'm going to kick this off by, as I said to Nancy backstage, sort of fangirling all over her. I have to tell you, Nancy, I know that you read Z because we corresponded a little bit ahead of this event, but I should tell you that Loving Frank was the book that, I mean, in and of itself, mind-blowingly wonderful. I couldn't believe it was a debut novel. I'm so jealous and I hated you, but I loved you for writing this amazing book. And it wasn't exactly a template for me when I went to write Z, but it was the book that showed me that a book like that could be written and could succeed with readers, and gave me the encouragement at that point in my career where I had 3 books behind me, which were just contemporary fiction, that the third of which had arrived dead, stillborn, and I was remaking my career, and I wanted to write historical based stories. And so I read Loving Frank in that period of time, and it was a gift to me, and I treasure it for that reason, in addition to it just being an excellent novel. So
Thank you. Thank you.
Way. I didn't realize, however, until I went back and I read your bio for this evening, I think I did know at one point, but I'd forgotten that we're both Illinois girls.
Where are you from in Illinois?
I grew up in Milan, Illinois, which is part of the Greater Quad Cities.
Okay.
A couple hours north, 2.5 hours north of Springfield, where you are from.
Mm-hmm.
You're like, I've never heard of Milan, right? Nobody has ever heard of Milan.
I confess, I haven't heard of Milan before.
Yeah, no. Why
it's
would
so
you?
funny. How big was it?
Oh, 4,000 people, maybe. Do you know Rhode Island, Moline?
Yeah.
Okay, so just come down on the Rock River a little bit, and there's Milan, little bedroom community. So we are both Midwestern born. We are both now authors who are evidently interested in a lot of the same kinds of things. And so it is just a delight for me to get to pick your brain about many of those things on the event of the publication of this wonderful book. Okay, so I have a number of notes to follow, and we're going to be taking questions from everybody who's participating in this webinar with us this evening. And thank you all for joining us tonight. There's a pretty big crowd. I'm kind of intimidated.
Great.
So we're going to do Q&A at the end, but let's start with just sort of broad strokes here. You published Loving Frank in 2007. Another 7 years before Under a Wide and Starry Sky.
Right.
And a little bit longer since then until this novel. So I wonder, is that deliberate because you just need that much time, research and form it up? Or do you do, and then, 2 years writing about it? I'm really, really interested to know that.
Yeah. The first book I wrote, Loving Frank, I didn't even know I was writing historical fiction. I just knew there was a story that I heard about that I really wanted to tell. And I think it took 7 years to get it down, to do the research, to, imagine. And at one point, I threw away a 400-page manuscript because I had chosen multiple points of view and I wasn't happy with the outcome. And I thought, well, how can I write about Mama from her point of view if she dies before the end? And I just decided to go with it. And I thought I could manage it, and it worked out. That was a great lesson I learned from that book. But sometimes it takes that long to get a book out. It just took, you're just going with it. You're seeing where it's going. You're seeing if you're happy with it. And about 2 years in, I was not happy with it. So I tossed the book. But that was not the case for the second one. And with this one, it has taken longer because when you take on Abraham Lincoln, there's a lot to know. And I didn't, again, it was so much to learn, but I had specific reasons for pursuing it. And I knew I was taking on a big chunk of history. Mostly the book focuses, for the first half of it at least, on the 1850s. And I wanted to understand the buildup to the Civil War. And I can explain to you how I came to write that book. But in any case, it took me 8 years, and it was a lot of research for this particular book.
I was going to come to this, and we'll come back in a minute to how and why you decided to do this. But I was like, okay, so you had to learn all about Lincoln himself. You had to learn all about Mary Todd Lincoln. You had to learn all about Springfield, where, you grew up there, but that doesn't mean that you're
Very
steep.
different. Yeah.
The deep history of Springfield. And then you had to invent and then understand the background of your character, Anna, right? And she's from Madeira, which is Portugal, right? History that brought her family ultimately to Springfield. You had to understand who the free Blacks were who lived in Springfield at that time. The Underground Railroad in the Midwest, who knew, right? I sure did. The 1908 riot in Springfield, the Civil War. I mean, now I'm thinking, how could you do this in only 8 years? Honestly.
Really? Well, so many books about the Civil War are about the military aspect of it. And while that figures into this, it's not a big part of it at all. This is much more about the hometown of Abraham Lincoln, the place he chose as his hometown. I wanted to explore how people in that town, a northern town, there were no battles in Illinois. I wanted to understand how they experienced the buildup to the Civil War and the impact, what the war was like in Illinois, and in particular in Springfield. There was a prisoner of war camp there. And I wanted to understand the subsequent events that happened post-war, and that race riot felt very distant from the chunk of the story, but at the same time, I thought it was absolutely essential to be in this book, because it was a reflection of what had happened to the town and the whole nation. And Springfield was like another whole character itself. It was a microcosm of the United States in a way. There were New Englanders who were abolitionists who moved to Illinois. There were Southern people from bordering states to Illinois, Kentucky, Missouri, so forth, who moved north and brought Southern slavery attitudes with them. And there were all these immigrants who came. And so I wanted to kind of explore what the experience was like for immigrants, for people who lived in town, for Black families who were free and who were under duress. So my method very often, I'm covering a lot of ground here, but
Fascinating.
My method is really to look at the forces bearing down on people in their time, that world they live in, what's bearing down on those people. It's not only that Anna, who's the primary narrator, it's not only that her family is experiencing the difficulties of having to flee their own country, to live in Trinidad for a year, harvesting sugarcane, and then to move to the middle of Illinois, not near any water. They'd always been near water. And not only all that, but to have to master the language, to have to find work and put food on the table, and then to have to realize that they were approaching a war.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a lot.
It's a lot.
I think because the way you're explaining it, it helps me understand sort of one of my questions, which is sort of, why did you invent, a character through whom to show, this tremendous tapestry of influences and forces and confluences that shaped the history of Springfield and the history of the nation, really, beyond that. Tell me, and maybe this is just one of those things that authors think about, but so the title for the novel, The House of Lincoln, I think probably some people take that quite literally. Some readers come to it and think that it's going to be the story all about just living with Abe and Mary. But in fact, I think it seems to me more sort of the House of Lincoln is all of that history and the nation at that time, and that you fit that into this story that you bracket with Anna as an older woman at the beginning, and then come back to her as an older woman at the end. I just thought it was brilliant.
So. Thank you so much. And you know what? Thank you for describing it that way and getting it, because I think the title can be misunderstood. Of course, it's the House of Lincoln, and you think, well, his house in Springfield is the visitor's site, and there was the White House. There was his hat, top hat, where he put his ideas. Well, it contained his remarkable brain, but besides, he would make notes of his ideas and stick them in his hat. But even beyond that, it's what's remarkable about him is that he came out of an essentially very prejudiced, racially prejudiced environment in Illinois. and he grew.
Yeah.
And it is his world. He carried the country along with him, which is amazing, that
It's
he
amazing,
managed to do that.
especially given the person he was. He almost had to be sort of dragged into the presidency, and it was a bad fit. Politics was a bad fit, and yet, he's one of our greatest presidents. And I just
The list
because it was a bad
over again,
Yeah.
and yet he was raw material when Mary met him.
That's right. So let me
a lot to do with it.
a little bit, because so we have your two previous novels that are helmed by these women who I would call unusual women. Some people would say they are unlikable women, and yet you bring, well, in each case, I found that even the behaviors of these women that I found troubling, I could understand them. And I think that that's a particular gift that you have as a person, as an author, that you can see the humanity in these people. And like you said, you want to imagine the forces that are brought to bear on the characters in your stories. And so you do that with Mary here. And even though we're kind of getting her through Anna's perspective, I still could see so clearly, Mary's humanity and the way that she and Abe, good old Abe, how their marriage was this sort of tug of war of. I should just let you describe that, actually, because you were in it more intimately with them.
Well, you brought so many things to mind. Mary's gotten a bad rap from historians, a number of historians. But when I write about real people, I really try hard to give them the benefit of the doubt. There's a reason that Lincoln stayed married to her. I mean, I think there was definitely a connection between them beyond a sense of responsibility for having, asked her to marry him and then changed his mind and then changed his mind again and decided to marry her. Mary was savvy about politics. She was well educated, more educated formally than he was. But Mary saw the jewel when a lot of other people didn't. And she had been raised to marry some gentleman who was.
Right. And didn't she had a sister, her sister Elizabeth, who absolutely was not having this courtship between them to start with.
Yeah. Right. And she overcame that, her sister's disapproval. So I think that Mary was strong-willed, and I think Mary had issues. There's no question about it. And I think Mary probably had real moments of mental illness. When I look at the end of her life, and I look at really the overview of her life, I see a woman who repeatedly lost children. She lost 3 children. She was sitting next to her husband when he was assassinated, holding his hand. Show me a person who doesn't go crazy from that.
No, exactly right.
It's just incredible what she put up with, and what when at the end, when she really thought that when their son Willie died, when they were in the White House, she thought she had brought that on herself, and they had brought it on themselves by being ambitious. So she really struggled within herself and felt guilt about it. And I think Mary was complicated. I think Mary needs to be seen as a person who was very influential with Lincoln, at least while he was in Illinois. Some historians said that it was Mary, that Lincoln became president because of 2 people, Mary Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. And, Stephen Douglas was in agreeing to debate Lincoln. Stephen Douglas allowed his Lincoln's star to shine. And that was a marvelous time when technology was allowing, well, first of all, when reporters were using shorthand to capture what was said in those debates, and then to have it put on the wire and have it shared all over the country. They were arguing for the entire country, even though it was just little old Illinois. They were arguing for the whole country about the issue of the expansion of slavery, and that set Lincoln up for the next step, surely. And Mary certainly did too. So I think Mary really doesn't deserve the bad rap she's gotten. I think she's, there were not drugs for whatever she had in those days,
and no, counseling that would have done her very much good at the time.
right.
So the fact that she made it through as well as she did, I think, is a testament to the strength of her character.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
We circle back to sort of how you came to decide on this subject matter, because it's a little bit different wheelhouse compared to your previous novels that really are more about the intimacy, the relationship between two people. And here you've taken on something much bigger in scope. But
Yes.
how and why did you decide to do
So
that?
big, I really had moments of complete despair, thinking, I don't know if I can do this. But well, it was 2014. I had finished Under the Wide and Starry Sky and had done the tour and was looking for another book project. And 2014 was a year when there was a lot going on. And we were a year into the Black Lives Matter movement. There was talk about polarization, as there is now. And politicians and others were saying, this is as close to a civil war as we've come since the Civil War. This is worrisome, this polarization, this ideological difference between groups. And I was just struck by the fact that, do these people know what the Civil War really was, how terrible it was?
Yeah, they were sort of tossing the term around pretty casually.
Yes, loosely, it felt like to me. And I started reading about the Civil War, and it turned out that if you added up all the deaths of wars, starting in the War of 1812 in the United States, and going all the way through World War I, World War II, and Korea, the number of deaths was less than the number of deaths of soldiers in the Civil War. 620,000, depends. There are two numbers that float around. Another number is something like a more recent number is 750,000, and that may be including civilian casualties. But in any case, that was a horrific bloodbath. And so when people talk about a civil war, I'm very disturbed by that. And so I started reading about the Civil War, and I started reading about Springfield, and I knew that 50 years I had grown up in Springfield, exposed to a lot about Lincoln, but one thing that had not been part of any curriculum was the fact that 50 years after Lincoln's death, there was a 1908 race riot, it was called, and still is called that. And 2 men were lynched, and several people were died in a white mob attacked Black businesses and attacked Black homes in an adjoining community. People lost their homes; they were burned to the ground. Hundreds of people took refuge in, and really it was an effort to just get rid of Blacks in Illinois, in Springfield. That was how it was expressed by rioters. So I thought it was a complete repudiation of Lincoln's philosophy. And so I started to think about how could that have happened? And why are we where we are now? Why didn't the Civil War end everything? Well, it's obvious that it ended slavery. It did not end racism. And that continued on, and there were many other factors that caused the American racism to continue. So I decided to just focus on Springfield and focus on some people who could tell the story. And the primary narrator is a girl who comes to Springfield at the age of 9, Anna, who is a Portuguese immigrant. She's 11 when we meet her, and she befriends an African-American girl named Cal. Their moms both work across the street from the Capitol in Springfield, and they work at an open air market on Chicken Row. And Chicken Row was the name of the nickname of a street there. And so I had Anna, I had her friendship, which could reveal their experiences together as they ventured around the town. And Anna then goes to work for the Lincolns. Eventually, her friend Cal will too. And the Lincolns, I should explain, the Lincolns had employees who were Portuguese, and they had 4 women employees who were free African-American women. So in any case, I had a story forming. Then I realized that I started looking into Illinois history, and I was horrified to discover that there were a set of really oppressive Black laws in Illinois.
That surprised me too. And, I went to school in the public school system. I learned all the basic things about Illinois' history, and I had no sense that that was the case. I mean, honestly, well, please continue.
Well, but I mean, so that really made me want to have a Black narrator who could explain what life was like for the free Black people in Springfield. And there's this remarkable family called the Donegans who were real. And I based that narrator on Spencer Donegan, who started the first AME church in Springfield and who was a barber who occasionally worked on Lincoln. He was a partner in a barber shop with one of Lincoln's close friends, whose name was William Florville. So I had those 2 narrators, and the third, of course, is Mary Lincoln. And we get her view, and these characters interact and affect each other. And ultimately, you get the world around Springfield. This book is as much about the people who knew Lincoln, nurtured Lincoln from a truly awkward country lawyer to a man who is voted regularly as the best president the United States ever had. He had a brilliant mind, and he was capable of change, which was so wonderful. He could evolve. When something wasn't working, he went at it again,
Yeah, he was obviously a person of he had a deep conviction about fairness, it seems to me. And so I know you through Anna, you illustrate some of the things that influenced those changes in his perceptions and his attitudes that did ultimately lead to the position against slavery. So, if nothing else, I mean, I hope people will read this novel and just say, wow, maybe there is some hope that people who hold a particular position can, through exposures and education and experience, come to see things differently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's great.
I think there's definite hope in this book, and yet I think there's a real recognition of the alienation that exists also.
Absolutely right. In terms of your narrators, the people with whom we see this story, also sort of inspired choice was to give us Anna's husband, Owen, pieces of correspondence between the two of them. So, you didn't have to create a character necessarily who's in the war exactly, but you give us a witness to some of the campaign, and then you give us a witness to some of the war situation. And I just thought, yeah, and Nancy Horan is a pretty smart woman.
Thank you.
I think
You
so.
did the same thing. You have done the same thing. I have,
Just
honestly, I read recently A Well-Behaved Woman, and I loved it. And I thought, here's the thing that you did that I have tried to do in my books, is not to judge the character. Alva could have been judged ruthless.
And she is. Well,
Right.
thank you.
But you kind of showed her world,
Yeah.
how her world was and how she had to function by those rules.
Right. Well, I mean, honestly, the situation in which a person finds themselves, whether it's by birth or it's by marriage or other forces on them, has so much to do with the choices that they make. And, so that is really evident, not only in your portrayal of Abraham Lincoln and in Mary, but also, Anna and her journey through the story. So I thought that was a terrific kind of mixing of real characters from history and then this invented character who of course is based on real people, real experiences. I think it's just great. Can we talk about this book all night? Let's see, questions that we haven't really talked about so far, because we're getting close to opening up to the wider Q&A. Themes in your fiction. I'm always interested in this question because it's something people ask me a lot, and I know different writers approach it different ways. Do you discover the themes as you do your research and start your writing, or do you kind of have themes in mind? Like, for example, okay, obviously themes like marriage for women in the early 1900s with Mama, and in her marriage, and then her desire to have this new relationship with Frank Lloyd Wright, and she has children, and what can you do in all of that? That's kind of taking on a big theme, but it seems like that's inherent kind of in the material. With the House of Lincoln, I feel like you could have had so many themes. You do have so many themes, but I'm not saying this question very coherently, but just, is it something that you bring to it? I'm going to write a book about racism. I'm going to write a book about class. I'm going to write a book about feminism. Or do you get captivated first by some nugget of story, and then the themes sort of bloom from that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think I get captivated and themes bloom. I think it would be dangerous if I set out with a particular theme in mind, and was really sticking to it, because I would just make it a treatise of some kind.
Well, yeah, I mean, it can, I think, sometimes succeed, but maybe it depends on the writer. Do you know Kim Stanley Robinson and his novel, The Ministry for the Future? Have you heard about this book?
I've heard of it, yeah.
Well, so Stan is in this case, I mean, he writes about, it's mostly science fiction, all science fiction. This book got a lot of attention because President Obama anointed it one of his, favorite books of the year lists. But Stan brought to that project, I want to write a book about the climate change crisis. And then he took that theme and he populated a story from. So I mean, I think it can work. Maybe we should do that, because then maybe President Obama would put our books on his list.
Maybe so. You know what? I think I did start with a real effort to figure out why we are still stymied by race issues.
Wow.
and haunted by them. And bothered by them. We have a bad track record, and I wanted to study that and figure it out, why things haven't been solved by now. And the information is all there. You can go and study and figure out, a lot of what happened in Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction, and Jim Crow laws, and it just continues on and on. So what struck me, though, I'm sorry, what struck me is that Lincoln, what I didn't realize about Lincoln, he was accused of, by his critics, of being very slow moving. Abolitionists were appalled by how slowly he moved, but Lincoln said, I will only go as fast as the people are able to go. And what I realized is that Springfield and Illinois, and Illinois was not the only one with black laws. It was across the Midwest. It's just that Illinois laws were the worst. But racism was endemic. It was in the air. It was the status quo. So Lincoln wasn't going to move very fast, given the world he was living in. And so you observe what he did. He when they went to war, it was about saving the Union. In time, Emancipation Proclamation came. It was always about slavery. It was always about that. But some people don't admit that. It very much was. But Lincoln kept changing, kept evolving. Somehow, how he brought people along was, I don't know, it was remarkable that he did it. And it might have been quite different, the history that we've lived through during and after Reconstruction. It might have been quite different had he lived.
Had he lived, yeah, I know, that's, gosh. You wonder about all the horse trading that occurred during Reconstruction.
50s. Oh, well, the horse trading, yeah, absolutely. But, in the 1850s, the 1850s were just about, somehow a tug of war between the South and the North, between slavery and non-slavery. And it was just these compromises that were awful. Like one thing that came out of a compromise was the Fugitive Slave Act to keep the South, calm. What they did was pass the Fugitive Slave Act. It was a federal law that said that across the United States, what had to happen is that local law authorities and citizens had to assist the law people in the apprehension of anybody they thought was a runaway slave, so they could return that person. I mean, there were big compromises made. It was to a point where they couldn't compromise anymore.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And you could not have known, even though you sort of heard the drums in the distance when you started this project, but I don't think you could have known how timely it would still be in 2023.
That's shocking. And I mean, literally repetitive and resonant of that history. Did you know that when Lincoln in 1860 went to, well, you do know because it's in the book, but when Lincoln went to the inauguration, first of all, he had to go into Washington sort of incognito, very quietly. There were death threats against him all the time. But beyond that, there were threats for his inauguration. And even before the inauguration, there were threats that there would be an uprising against the vote counting, the electoral vote counting.
I've never heard of that.
Yeah. And so there was this old style general who somehow avoided that happening. There were rumors of resurrections in the planning stage all over Washington, D.C. It was a southern town. And it was a case where this general put police and soldiers all over Washington and prevented an insurrection and also prevented the killing of Lincoln at his own inauguration. So
I'm astonished not only by that point in history, but in points of history in our country, but also in Eastern Europe. I mean, pick your place where there has been bloodshed that is I was going to say earlier, the top down flow of the attitude of the people in power becomes the attitude of the people on whom they count to enact the violence against, whomever, whether it's, racial violence or, threats to assassinate Abraham Lincoln or Mike Pence. If Lincoln had not been assassinated and that we had more Lincolns in his wake, I think we would be in a better place in the country now. But I'm preaching to the choir here, I know that. But I think, the book really does, by showing us our own, it's a mirror, really, that we're looking into our own past and seeing ourselves currently. And I think the more people who are exposed to these kinds of stories, the better chance we have of perhaps changing some things. And I know that, you're not writing this as polemical, you're writing it because it fascinates you and it interests you and it's all real stuff. But I do think that literature can have some effect. And I think that actually the book talks kind of about the importance of literature.
I think we're lucky to be. I know you do contemporary. You're good at shifting around, but I know with historical fiction you can bring life to an old moment in time, and it's impossible not to view it from our perspective now. To view those days and maybe learn something from it, hopefully, or see it in new light. And a lot of here, inevitably, there's a story underneath the story. And that's what I like to find, because there are all kinds of stories that were going on in Springfield besides Abraham Lincoln.
Absolutely. Yeah, so more work to do. Let's pivot to questions from folks. And it looks like some people are putting their questions in the chat, not only in the Q&A. So I'm going to open chat as well. And let's take a question from, Teresa M. She was first on the mark. She wants to know, what's the best piece of writing advice that you've received and that you still use in your own writing? Did you ever get advice early on? You must have gotten really good advice, because that first novel, damn.
Well, my own advice to somebody is that curiosity is your best friend when you're a writer. You need curiosity. If you're trying to figure out what to write about, what are you interested in, really? Yeah. And what do you want to learn about? Because it's going to take you a while. It ought to be interesting to you. And so that would be my own advice. I did, I don't know if anybody, I took only 2 fiction writing classes from a very tough teacher at University of Chicago Extension, Molly Daniels. And she said to me, after we had been in her class, the whole class had been pouring our hearts and souls onto paper. And at the end of it, she said, you could write a novel, but you haven't found your material yet. And so your material, it turns out, I think what she was doing was saying, look, I just spent a semester allowing you all to pour out all the emotional red herrings. And I want you now to go out and find your material. You got that out of your system.
Oh, what a great approach.
Isn't it interesting? And I kind of think that's what she was up to. So I did look around and found something that interested me. I was curious about Frank Lloyd Wright, and I saw this little bit about his life and this chapter that occurred, and so that was how I found my material. So I guess that was advice.
No, that was good advice, and it's good advice to share. And I kind of just piggyback on that just a little bit, because I wrote a short essay recently about when the most successful of my books to this point have been the projects with which I got obsessed, not merely interested, because the interest is like your entry point, but then, that where all you want to do is research more and learn more and understand more and see the connections. And while you're doing that, the story is almost forming itself, in your hindbrain.
Yes.
And so getting obsessed, I feel like, especially for people who are, maybe they're taking the next step in their writing journey, where they are competent writers, and now they really need to understand sort of what material is going to work best for them, that put aside the things that are just merely interesting and take up the things that are absolutely obsessively interesting.
And I have to confess that I've been obsessed 3 times.
Yeah.
Those 3 books I've written have been the result of obsessions. So, and you're saying that's the case with you too.
Yeah.
I have to ask you, does a person have to be an obsessive person to be a writer?
I'm not. That's what I think is so interesting. I'm people who know me, and I know one of my friends, Cheryl Cornett, is watching us right now, could say I am even Stephen, boy, I am just the calm, logical, it's hard to ruffle me.
Yeah.
But when it comes to like putting a story together, that's where it is. That's where my obsession lives. It's a safe spot.
Yeah, that's where I live too. It could be also that the reason it takes me so long, I'm trying to justify 8 years, but I like to get away from it too. I have to have a life besides that. So
that's a good idea, having a life besides. That's advice for you also, Teresa. Have a life besides writing. Okay, we will move on since we're going to run out of time. Maurice says, what is the lesson we can take away about human behavior from your novel? That's interesting. That's a big question.
Oh, it's such a big question, isn't it?
But maybe just a couple of bullet points on that.
Well, I would say that one observation is that Lincoln said some terrible racist things himself early in the debates with Douglas, and the difference was that he was capable of keeping an open mind, and he still clung to other things, though. He clung to the notion of colonization, which was
that's right.
Truly objectionable, and it was supposed to be voluntary and all that, but he finally let go of that, I think, toward the very end. But I think that human behavior is can be appalling, and I think that you can't let down your efforts to overcome that. It's hateful behavior is probably always going to be with us. And if you stay silent, it only gets bigger. And I think that, that's exactly.
I think that's right. I think that the more pressure there is against these elements, even though they are always going to be part of humankind's nature, they don't have to run the show.
Right. Yeah.
Good advice. Good. Okay. Somebody wants to talk about the ending, but I don't want us to get into any spoilers. So I'm going to table.
I agree with you on that. I think we should hold off on that. Yeah.
All right. Can either or both of us speak to if any challenges about writing history? Wait, I don't know what you want to know here, Cheryl. Can we speak to if any challenges about writing history rooted by, I'm going to have to, Cheryl, can you clarify? We'll come back to you. Nancy, who are some of your favorite authors?
Oh gosh, I hate that question because I love everything. But
How about some recent favorite books? Not, you already said A Well-Behaved Woman, so you're off the hook for that.
Oh God, I'm trying to, Sebastian Barry lately. I've been
Yeah.
just reading Sebastian Barry, and who else do I like? Jane Gardam.
I don't know Jane Gardam.
She's a British writer. She wrote Old Filth. I don't know if you know this, but sometimes that's what I'll go to that is so different from what I'm working on.
Yeah.
I had a classical education. I was an English literature major. So, I got all that wonderful stuff, the Russians and the English writers and so forth. But, contemporary writers, I'm finding, I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
I love your work.
Thank you. Gosh, I mean, usually I'm reading for research, which I'm so thick into at the moment, but I would say Nancy and I share a friendship with a writer named Karen Joy Fowler. You cannot go wrong by picking up a Karen Joy Fowler novel, short story.
Absolutely. She's fantastic. And she's regularly, on the Booker Prize.
Right? Yeah.
She wrote Booth at the same time that I was working on this book. And yeah, we talked sort of in a limited way about what we were working on, but we both started at the same time, and she finished where I did.
She brought pieces of Booth to this workshop that I told you she's at currently. So it was really wonderful to see it finally, emerge as a finished book.
I want to recommend a book that's just out, Gail Tsukiyama's book, The Brightest Star, about Anna Wong, who was the first successful Asian actress who starred in starring roles in talking films. I don't know if she was in any non-talking films, but it's a very interesting book about that woman. Yeah. Plenty of great books out there.
Lots, so many things to read. Oh gosh, what was the most challenging process in getting your book published? This is probably a good question to apply to Loving Frank more than to your subsequent novels.
Yeah. I was in a writers group back in Illinois, and a friend of mine, Elizabeth Berg, and she's very, very popular novelist, throw her books in as popular and favorite books. And she actually suggested me to her agent. At first, I didn't have an agent, and there was a person who kept losing the manuscript. So anyway, I finally did get an agent. And, nowadays you really need an agent in publishing. And you did then, even then, which was 2006 when I was trying to sell that book. But as it turned out, it found a home, and I didn't go through. It was my first novel, and it was pure luck that I did find a home for that book. And
it's not exactly luck, because I read that book. It is so far and above what usually crosses the transom for agents and editors that I think that anybody who read it would have found it irresistible, honestly. That's just my opinion.
Yeah. Well, fortunately, Elizabeth helped me out there. And I think today, it's a real challenge for writers to do that. I understand now that you can self-publish and a publisher will pick it up and
Happens now and then. That's
yeah.
true. But I
Yeah.
think people are misled by those success stories into imagining that it happens frequently. And so it is a method by which you might get some exposure. And, I think there are some really actually quite good books being self-published just by people who are not interested in getting into the publishing ecosystem, and that's, I think, is a completely viable path. I think we just need to, know what our goal is for our work and then act accordingly. I was a slush pile find. I didn't have anyone to my agent. And in fact, she had rejected me a couple of manuscripts prior when I was, a baby writer, and I was trying to find an agent with the first novel that I'd ever written, and she had passed on that. And then I queried her with the novel that I'd written as my MFA thesis, and she took that. But then we didn't sell that book, and I wrote another book, and we sold that one. So,
which was
my very first novel in 2007 was called Souvenir. And it's a rather sentimental story. I think someone described it, I think my publisher may have described it at the time as like if Jodi Picoult and Nicholas Sparks got together and birthed a book, it might be this novel kind of thing. I think it's a fine book for a first novel, not as fine as Loving Frank. If I had it to do all over again, I would definitely do some things differently. But it was my entry into the world of being published, and I have, honestly, I've been making my living from my fiction ever since. So,
yeah, you have. And so, did you went to a writing program?
Yes, I went to a writing program between the first novel that never got representation, and then I wrote a thesis that was the novel that got me representation. So I shortcutted the process for myself, but not in terms of contacts in the industry. So I still didn't know anyone who could recommend me. I didn't have Elizabeth Berg, dang it, So again, just illustrating that there are a lot of different ways that we who are succeeding with our fiction found our way in. But the important thing is to write something that is as polished as you can make it, and then follow whatever steps make sense for your career goals.
Yeah.
Let's see. Nancy, have you read T.C. Boyle's novel The Women, about Frank Lloyd Wright's relationship with his 4 women? Gloria says, I read it, enjoyed it, and then was so happy to discover Loving Frank that delved into Maima's story. Your book was written 2 years before The Women, and I wonder if the author discussed his subject with you. How interesting.
I've never met him, but I did read the book and it was interesting. He talked about more than Maima Borthwick in that book. He talked about several women.
Yeah.
In his life. So and T.C. Boyle has a certain style, he's followed by so many people who he's got a sense of irreverence about the style. And so it was very different. They were very different books. And I never really did talk to him about it because I've never bumped into him, but
opportunity may still be in your future. We are right on 8 o'clock. Let me see if there's anything in here that we can squeeze in real quick, like. Oh my goodness. I see. Cheryl says, can we speak to any challenges about writing history-rooted biography? I got you, Cheryl. There's a hyphen there. The challenges, I think, and you can tell me if you agree with this, particularly when you are creating a story entirely from your imagination, you get to decide everything. But when you are creating a story based on biography and real history, for me anyway, the challenge is excavating a plot out of all of that information. Does that seem?
That seems very right. Yeah. And the other part of it for me is that I find it much more comfortable to hew to the historical record because I find it interesting in and of itself. And I think in a way for me, I need to be able to do that, you know, to have that strong history.
It
So
makes
I stick real close. It's the skeleton. of the-
skeleton, yeah, the scaffold that we use.
Yeah.
There's some great questions. I wish we had more time to do that, but I know that Marnie and company would like to call it a night. So I'm gonna just close out our little portion here before Marnie comes back. I want to say, Nancy, I just appreciate so much how humane your novels are. I feel like you are doing really good work not just, I'm not talking about skill, I'm talking about doing good period with these novels. And
Sure.
in The House of Lincoln, you include this quote. This is on page 319. And I just feel like this is sort of a good epilogue for our chat here. It's a Lincoln quote. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. As our case is new, we must think anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save the country.
Disenthrall.
Disenthrall.
I thought, what did he mean by disenthrall? And I think he meant we are so enthralled by our sense of our superiority or whatever. I just felt like he was saying, let go of it and see if we can really make everything better. So
Good.
you can interpret it a lot of ways, but there are so many brilliant quotes from Lincoln.
Oh, yeah.
Really wonderful material to work with.
All right, Marnie, I think we can invite you back.
Yeah.
Thank you so
you.
much
Thank you so much.
for
Great.
joining us tonight. This was a fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Marnie. Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Nice knowing you.
Hope to see you again.
Bye-bye.
Bye.